In the peaceful neighborhood of Willow Creek, Salt Lake City, Utah, the Hansen family lived at 1346 Willow Creek Drive. John Hansen, a 42-year-old accountant, was a respected member of the community. He lived with his two wives, Karen and Emily, in a sprawling, well-maintained house that reflected his seemingly successful life. John had married Karen on June 12, 1998. They had spent over 2 decades together, building what many believed was a strong and loving marriage. However, John's religious beliefs led him to marry again, this time to a younger woman named Emily, on September 18, 2015. The community, familiar with the practice of polygamy, didn't question John's decision, but the introduction of Emily into the household began to unravel the family's harmony. Karen, who had always been the center of John's world, found it difficult to share her husband with another woman. Despite her initial attempts to accept Emily, jealousy and resentment began to eat away at her. She noticed that John seemed to spend more time with Emily, laughing more easily and showing affection in ways that he hadn't with Karen in years. Emily, on the other hand, was eager to make her place in the family. She was aware of Karen's discomfort and tried her best to be respectful and kind. But the tension between the two women was palpable, and as much as Emily tried to avoid conflict, the situation at home grew increasingly hostile. The Hansen household, once warm and inviting, became a place of silent battles and unspoken grievances. Karen's insecurities turned into an obsession. She began keeping a close eye on John and Emily, scrutinizing their every move, questioning their every interaction. The strain on Karen was visible, and she often confided in her close friend, Lisa Thompson, about her fears of losing John. On January 14, 2023, Karen's suspicions reached a boiling point when she found a receipt for a necklace in John's car. The receipt was dated January 8th, and the necklace had been purchased at a high-end jewelry store, Madison Avenue. It wasn't Karen's birthday, and she knew it wasn't for her. The discovery ignited a fire of jealousy that consumed her. Karen confronted John that night, accusing him of favoring Emily and ignoring her needs. John, who had indeed bought the necklace for Emily as an anniversary gift, tried to calm Karen down, but his attempts only fueled her anger. Karen began to distance herself from John, spending more time alone in her room or out of the house. Despite the growing tension, John continued to live his life as though nothing had changed. He went to work at his office at 5173 Meadow Lane, attended church services at 2432 Maplewood Avenue, and maintained his social connections. But beneath his calm exterior, John was growing increasingly frustrated with Karen's behavior. He felt trapped between his two wives, unable to please either of them. On the night of February 19, 2023, the Hansen family was supposed to attend a community event at their church. John had insisted that both Karen and Emily accompany him, hoping to show the community that everything was fine at home. Karen, however, was not in the mood for pretenses. She had spent the entire day brooding over the receipt she had found and the growing distance between her and John. That evening, John received a phone call just as they were getting ready to leave. He told Karen and Emily that it was an urgent work matter and that he needed to go to the office for a few hours. He promised to join them at the event later. Karen watched as John left the house, her mind racing with thoughts of what he was really up to. She decided to follow him, convinced that he was going to see Emily. She grabbed her coat and left the house, ignoring Emily's concerned questions. Karen's car trailed behind John's as he drove towards his office, but instead of heading to 5173 Meadow Lane, John took a detour and stopped at a small house on 1832 Elm Street. Karen parked a few houses away and watched as John entered the house. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat there, her mind spiraling with dark thoughts. After about an hour, John emerged from the house. But to Karen's surprise, he wasn't alone. A man whom Karen didn't recognize walked out with him. The two men talked briefly before getting into their respective cars and driving off in opposite directions. Karen, confused and suspicious, decided to return home. When Karen arrived back at 1346 Willow Creek Drive, she found Emily sitting in the living room waiting for her. Emily, concerned about Karen's behavior, tried to ask what was going on, but Karen, still reeling from what she had seen, snapped at her. The two women began to argue, their voices rising in anger. The argument quickly escalated into a physical confrontation. Karen, her emotions spiraling out of control, grabbed a kitchen knife in a fit of rage. Emily, terrified, tried to run, but Karen was faster. She stabbed Emily multiple times, leaving her bleeding on the floor. As Emily lay dying, Karen suddenly realized the horror of what she had done. She dropped the knife and sank to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. But it was too late. The damage had been done. When John returned home later that night, he found the house eerily quiet. He called out to Karen and Emily, but received no response. As he walked into the kitchen, the sight that greeted him was beyond comprehension. Emily's lifeless body lay in a pool of blood, and Karen sat beside her, covered in blood and shaking with fear and grief. John immediately called the police, who arrived within minutes and took Karen into custody. The news of Emily's murder shocked the entire community. People who knew the family were in disbelief. How could such a thing happen in a household that seemed so peaceful? The police began their investigation, and it didn't take long for them to conclude that Karen was the primary suspect. After all, she was found at the scene, covered in blood, and had a history of growing animosity towards Emily. The evidence seemed clear-cut, and Karen was charged with first-degree murder. During her trial, which began on April 5, 2023, at the Salt Lake County Courthouse, Karen's defense team argued that she had acted in a moment of temporary insanity, driven to the brink by the pressures of her polygamous marriage and her fear of losing John. They portrayed her as a woman who had lost control in the heat of the moment, not a cold-blooded killer. The prosecution, however, was relentless. They painted Karen as a jealous and obsessive woman who had let her emotions get the better of her. They pointed to the evidence, the knife, the receipt, and the history of tension between Karen and Emily. The jury was faced with what seemed to be a straightforward case, but as the trial progressed, subtle inconsistencies began to emerge. A forensic analysis of the crime scene raised questions about the exact sequence of events. The position of the body, the angle of the wounds, and the lack of defensive marks on Karen's hands all hinted that something was amiss. The prosecution dismissed these details as irrelevant, but the defense team wasn't so sure. As the trial neared its conclusion, Karen's defense attorney, Daniel Harris, made a last-ditch effort to introduce new evidence that had come to light. He presented surveillance footage from a nearby street camera on 1832 Elm Street, the location Karen had followed John to on the night of the murder. The footage showed John meeting with a man identified as Mark Thompson, a known associate with a criminal record. Daniel Harris argued that John's behavior that night was suspicious and that he might have had a motive to frame Karen for the murder. The defense team suggested that John, frustrated with the growing tension between his wives and wanting to free himself from Karen, had orchestrated the entire scenario to make it look like Karen had committed the crime. The footage also showed John returning home that night before Karen did, which contradicted his earlier statement that he had arrived after the murder. This new evidence cast doubt on John's testimony and raised questions about his involvement in the crime. The courtroom was stunned. The case, which had seemed so clear-cut, was now shrouded in uncertainty. The jury, tasked with deciding Karen's fate, was left to consider the possibility that John, not Karen, was the true culprit. The case took a dramatic turn when Mark Thompson was brought in for questioning. Under pressure, Mark revealed that John had paid him $10,000 to stage an alibi for him on the night of the murder. Mark admitted that he had met John at 1832 Elm Street, and that John had instructed him to make it look like they were having a business meeting. But the most shocking revelation came when forensic experts re-examined the knife used in the murder. They discovered traces of a sedative on the handle, a substance that had been used to drug Emily before she was stabbed. The sedative was found in John's possession during a search of his office, hidden in a drawer. Faced with this overwhelming evidence, John's demeanor changed. He became increasingly agitated, and during a private interrogation, he finally confessed. John admitted that he had planned Emily's murder for months. He had grown tired of the constant tension between his wives and had decided that the only way to resolve the situation was to eliminate one of them. He chose Emily as the target, believing that her death would be easier to explain and that Karen would be the obvious suspect given their history of conflict. John confessed that on the night of February 19, 2023, he had drugged Emily's drink, rendering her unconscious. He then staged a confrontation scene, planting the knife in Karen's hand after she had returned home, disoriented and emotionally distressed. John's plan was to make it appear as though Karen had lost control and killed Emily in a fit of jealous rage. John believed that with Karen's history of obsession and jealousy, no one would question her guilt. He thought he had created the perfect cover-up, but the unexpected turn of events and the meticulous investigation by the defense team unraveled his plot. The case, which had initially seemed to be a tragic but straightforward incident of domestic violence, had taken on a new, chilling dimension. Karen, who had been on the brink of being convicted for a crime she didn't commit, was released from custody. The charges against her were dropped, and she was exonerated, but the damage to her life was profound. Karen had lost not only her freedom, but also her reputation, her home, and the life she had once known. Emily's family, devastated by the loss, struggled to come to terms with the fact that John, someone they had trusted, had orchestrated her death. The community, too, was left reeling from the betrayal, questioning how well they truly knew the people they lived alongside. John Hansen was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. The trial that followed was swift, given his confession and the overwhelming evidence against him. On November 8, 2023, John was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, in his sentencing, remarked on the cold and calculating nature of John's crime, noting that his actions had destroyed not just one life, but many. For Karen, the road to recovery was long and arduous. Though she was free, she carried the scars of her ordeal, both emotionally and socially. She moved away from Salt Lake City, seeking a fresh start in a place where she wasn't known. Therapy and support from her close friends helped her begin to rebuild her life, but the trauma of what had happened would never fully leave her. In the years following the trial, the community of Willow Creek gradually began to heal. New families moved into the neighborhood, and the house at 1346 Willow Creek Drive was eventually sold to a couple who knew nothing of its dark past. Life moved on, but the memory of the Hansen case lingered, serving as a reminder of the fragility of human relationships and the potential for darkness within us all. Karen found some peace in her new life, though she would never forget what had happened. She wrote a memoir about her experiences, hoping that her story might help others who found themselves in similar situations. Her book, Shattered Trust, Surviving a Nightmare in Polygamy, became a bestseller, bringing her both closure and a new sense of purpose. John, now serving a life sentence in a maximum security prison, remained a subject of fascination for psychologists and criminologists alike. His case was studied as an example of how a person's internal conflicts and desire for control can lead to devastating consequences.